I'm interested in human nature. And in particular, I'm interested in aspects of human nature that pertain to our morality, to our sense of right and wrong. And as a starting point in my work, I tend to begin with Adam Smith, the great Scottish scholar. Now, many of you know Adam Smith as the founder of economics. He was the author of Wealth of Nations, which argued, among other things, that a system that had selfish individuals can, under the right circumstances, develop into sort of a system which actually confers benefit to everybody through the invisible hand of the market. And, a lot of people have different views on this, but what's important to realize is that Smith never himself believed that people were naturally selfish. In fact, his first book, for him the better book, is The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is all about our moral psychologies. And he begins the book, the very first words, with a claim about human nature that to me rings true. However, how selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him. That we often derive sorrow from the sorrow of others is a matter of fact too obvious to require any instances to prove it. And there's a lot of illustrations of this, but my favorite one comes from a psychologist, Thorndike, in the 1920s. So Thorndike was interested in what people like. And he decided to use a very simple method, a method used actually by behavioral economists and psychologists. Now, how much would people pay? So if I want to know how much you like something, I say how much you pay for it. And if I want to know how much you don't like something, I'd ask you how much would I have to pay you to do it? So he asked people, how much would I have to pay you to eat a worm? He asked people, how much would I have to pay you to live the rest of your life in Kansas? He was a big city guy, and to him. But I'll give you a couple of examples. One is, and answer this in your own head, how much would I have to pay you, Thorndike asked, to have one of your teeth removed with a pair of pliers? No anesthesia. So think about a number. Maybe some of you say there's no money in the world, but think about a number. And here's the number he got. And what I've done is I've taken his $1920 and turned them into contemporary dollars. So this is what the number would be now. Is that much money? And some of you might be thinking that's low, some of you think that's high, but that's what it comes up to. But he asked some other questions too, and the absolute numbers don't matter, but the comparison is interesting. Another question was, how much would I have to pay you to kill a cat with your bare hands? So everybody come up with a number right now. And that was the number he got. And as you see, it's over twice as much. Now, your mileage may vary. Some people might say, I would never do that for all the money in the world. Others would say, I'll do it for free. But for the most part, it seems like from his sample, there's an intuition here, which is that people would rather suffer an agonizing and disfiguring experience than do something terrible to another creature. And that says something, I think, about our human nature. Smith goes on to talk about the psychological mechanisms that might underlie our kindness. And one is what he called sympathy and what we would now call empathy. He describes it like this. When we see a stroke aimed and just ready to fall upon the leg or arm of another person, we naturally shrink and draw back our own leg or our arm. And when it does fall, we feel it in some measure and are hurt by it as well as the sufferer. And here's an illustration. There's a lot of neuroscience research looking at the underlying processes from which empathy derives from. And there's a lot of excitement, controversial, and I don't totally buy it, about mirror neurons in the brain that respond the same to one's own actions and another person's action. I tend to think this is a little bit overhyped, but it does seem clear that we do have a general propensity to reflect the actions and thoughts of other people. One example of this is from a soccer game. This guy misses a big kick. He's anguished. He puts his hands on the side of his head. That's not very interesting, but look at the people around him. Now, I'm a developmental psychologist. So the question I ask is, where do these moral sentiments and other things like moral judgments come from? It's possible that everything Smith says is correct, and yet still it's a developmental accomplishment. It's learned through culture and through parents that we have no moral sense to start with. And in fact, for much of our intellectual history, philosophers and psychologists would agree that we're moral blank slates. We start off with nothing. This was nicely satirized in this Onion headline. The idea that, children unrepentant sociopaths. I want to try to convince you in the brief time we have together that this is not entirely right. I want to try to convince you that there's a better way to look at it, and this view is actually associated with Adam Smith's contemporary, Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to a friend, "The moral sense or conscience is as much a part of man as his leg or arm. It is given to all human beings in a stronger or weaker degree, as force of members is given them in a greater or lesser degree." And Jefferson never studied kids, but there's a lot of evidence that he's right. So for instance, children will often show compassion, often anguish, when faced with the distress of another. As soon as they're old enough to move around, they'll do things like share, or hand over a toy to somebody who is depressed, or soothe by patting. Later on, they seem to be able to they didn't be motivated to initiate helping towards individuals, even if they're not prompted. So a nice study of this was done by Felix Varniken and Michael Tomasello, where they put toddlers in a room, and they had somebody in some sort of trouble. And the question is, would toddlers intervene without being prompted or otherwise motivated? And here's a clip from one of their studies.
Boom. Boom.
So this is one facet of morality. But there's other aspects of morality too. So this is Francis Hutchinson, who was Adam Smith's advisor when Smith was an undergraduate. And Hutchinson described what he was talking about, what he called a moral sense. And a moral sense for Hutchinson is not a motivation to do good or avoid doing evil. Rather, it's an ability to discern right from wrong. As on analogy of a perceptual sense. You could see color, you could hear sound, and you could tell right from wrong. And with my collaborators at Yale, in particular my wife and my colleague Karen Wynn, we've been looking to see whether babies possess this sort of moral sense. So in our initial studies were done with Valerie Kuhlmeier, who was a postdoc and is now at Queen's University. And Valerie was interested in, not in moral judgment, but in kids' ability to predict meaningful social behavior. And the question that she was interested in asking was, if you see one individual help another, do you expect that individual who was helped to approach the one that helped it? But if you see one individual hinder another, do you expect it to avoid the hinderer? So to test this, we showed babies animated movies. And I'll show you the sort of movies that our babies were shown. You could imagine yourself as a subject in one of our studies. And then babies would see either this or this. And what we found was for both 9-month-olds and 12-month-olds, they would look longer, indicating surprise when the character approached that which hindered it as opposed to that helped it. Interestingly, if you take away the faces from these characters, the effect goes away. Which is interesting because it suggests that it really is a social interpretation. And that if you don't see it socially anymore, you don't get that sort of effect. So we pursued this in a line of experiments we found very exciting. And then Kylie Hamlin, who was just a brand new graduate student, came and joined Karen's lab and says, you know, those are all fine studies, but there's a much simpler question you should be asking that's a lot more interesting. She points out that when you look at it as adults, the one who helps is a good guy, like a mensch. And the one who pushes down, kind of a jerk. Do babies feel the same way? Now to test this, we have to change our design. We have to move away from animated figures towards real figures, and move away from looking time, which is a good measure of surprise, to reaching, which is a good measure of preference. So I'll show you one of our, sort of a clip from one of the first studies that we did.
you're ready, up goes the curtain.
Now, just some experimental minutiae. For all of these studies, the color, shape, and side of the character was counterbalanced. So if babies had a preference to go for the left one, or the blue one, or the square one, it would wash out across the study. Because sometimes they'd be good, sometimes they would be bad. The person offering the baby the choice herself doesn't know who the good guy and bad guy were, so she can't unconsciously cue the baby. And the parents either close their eyes during choice, or in some of our studies, they have a visor blocking their vision, so they can't also sort of cue their baby to the right response. This is what a choice looks like. And these are results from our initial findings. Overwhelmingly, both 10-month-olds and 6-month-olds chose the good guy over the bad guy. So we published this in several other studies in the journal Nature, and some people liked this work. We were very happy. Other people thought, this is awful. This is, you're concluding a lot from a single paradigm, the up the hill, the down the hill. Maybe there's something funny about that. And they're exactly right. And what we've done over the 5 years that followed was do a series of other studies where we did other sort of one-act plays. 6 of them by now, 6 different types of one-act plays. And we found for each one of them, the youngest babies we could test tell the good guy from the bad guy. So rather than throw a lot of data at you, I'm going to put you in a position of the child. I'm going to show you one of our other one-act plays, and you tell me, you respond, whether you could tell who the good guy and who the bad guy is. And I promise you I wasn't going to show you data, but I will show you just an adorable choice trial. Now, so we did a series of studies like that, finding preferences for the good guy and for the bad guy. But a perfectly legitimate response, and one we struggled with, was, how do you know it's moral? How do you know it's the same sort of thing that adults do when we say, that's right and that's wrong? And it turns out this is a very difficult question. Philosophers have no criteria that they agree on, as even for adults, is what constitutes morality. So we explored different options. I'll tell you about one direction that we took. And to tell you this, I want to tell you a story. This guy in London a few years ago loses his cat. It was an outdoor cat, but every evening it came back when he called it, and one evening it doesn't come back. So he looks for it. He can't find it. He goes back to sleep, goes to sleep. The next morning he goes to take out the garbage, and he opens up the garbage bin, and there's the cat inside the bin. So he wonders, how did the cat get inside the bin? Well, London actually has cameras everywhere. So he found a camera pointing to the front of his house, and this is what he discovered. So he puts the video on Facebook and says, can anybody identify this woman? And sooner or later somebody does. And then a journalist actually come knocking at her door and asked her, why did you throw the cat in the bin? And her responses were not helpful. She says, it was a split second of madness. I thought it would be funny, and it's just a cat. But what's interesting from a sort of the point of view of moral psychology is, it's clear why the man would be upset. It's clear why the cat would be upset. But everybody was angry at the woman. It was put in the newspapers. She ultimately had to be put under police protection because of all the death threats. Her name is Mary Bale, and there was a Facebook page called Death to Mary Bale. And so there's a lot to be said about that. But it does seem interesting that one aspect of our psychology of good and evil is if we see something as evil, it's not just that we want to avoid it, we often want it to be punished. If we see them good, we want to be rewarded. And so we decided to do this. We did our first studies with older kids, where we showed them good guy, bad guy behaviors, and then we saw whether they would respond by not now by approaching, but by giving a treat to one who they'd give a treat to, versus taking away a treat or punishing. And what we found was, overwhelmingly, when it came to reward, they would reward the good guy and not the bad guy. But when it came to punishment, they would punish the bad guy and not the good guy. In other studies with younger children, we found that babies like characters who reward good guys, but they also like characters who punish bad guys. I'll end this section of the talk with a clip of one child. This is not typical, but one child, after the bad guy, he took away something from the bad guy, but that wasn't enough. And he took justice into his own hands. You might be thinking now that, look, I'm telling you all the morality that is present early on, that we are fundamentally good creatures. This is not my claim. I do think we have a moral core, but I think this moral core is limited, tragically limited, and I want to talk about two ways in which it's limited. The first limit is that the scope of morality early on, the scope of caring and compassion, is very narrow. It's very focused on those around you. It does not extend more broadly. Well, why would I believe this? One consideration is evolutionary, which is I think these moral capacities have evolved through natural selection. As such, it would make sense for them to be discriminate in who they resonate to. A creature that cares more for its friends than its strangers, who cares more for kin than stranger, would do better off than one that was indiscriminate and didn't care. Then there's cross-cultural evidence. So in a world, I'm surrounded largely by strangers here, but we are all getting along and conversing and everything. This is not the natural state of humans. In most small-scale societies, people respond very differently to strangers. This is Jared Diamond talking about the small-scale societies of Papua New Guinea, and he writes, "To venture out of one's territory to meet other humans, even if they lived only a few miles away, was equivalent to suicide." Margaret Mead was famously positive about the lifestyles of small societies, saying that they're better than our society in many ways. When it came to strangers, she was kind of blunt. Most primitive tribes feel if you run across one of those subhumans from a rival group in the forest, the most appropriate thing to do is bludgeon him to death. Then there's children themselves. So children often get extremely anxious when approaching strangers, something that developmental psychologists have helpfully called stranger anxiety. People say we're not theoretical, but yeah. Now, what about those cases? I started off my talk talking about the kindness and generosity of kids. All of that is true. But what I didn't tell you is that it's discriminate. Children will soothe and share and help, but they will do so far more to siblings and people they know than to strangers. Or take the Varnick and Tomasello study. It's a great study. But researchers in Stanford recently observed that these were not strangers. In fact, prior to this whole event, the adult and the child had played together in a reciprocal game. They did an experiment where they replicated their finding, but then they had a condition where they didn't play together. Helping dropped by way over half. And even then, they had some interaction. My bet is if they had no interaction at all, you'd find no helping at all. So this is the first limitation children have, a certain narrowness of the moral sense. And it's the first case where culture and parenting and society has to step in and expand things. The second limitation concerns a notion of equity and fairness. Mature humans, at least in our society, have a notion of things should be distributed equally, things should be fair, we should approach certain problems from a neutral perspective. But this does not appear to be natural. In fact, it takes a long time to develop in children, even within our society. And one illustration of this is some studies I've done with a graduate student, Mark Sheskin and Karen Wynn, was we decided to modify some behavioral economics games for use with children. And what they did was they get to play a game for poker chips. And the poker chips are later redeemed for toys. So they really want to accumulate the poker chips. And what they get to do is they get to choose whether to do the green one, and in this case there'd be one poker chip for the child and one poker chip for another child, a strange child. Or the blue one, 2 for the child, 3 for the strange child. And we use this method to see what do they think is fair, how do they want to distribute things. And so one of our contrasts is 1-1 versus 2-2. And that means 1 for the child and 1 for the other child, and versus 2 for the child, 2 for the other child. Now, if children are greedy, they should choose 2-2, because they get twice as much. If children are generous, they should choose 2-2, because the other kid gets twice as much. And reassuringly, at all ages, children choose 2-2. But now consider these contrasts, and play them out in your head as I talk them through. Imagine, try to feel what temptations you feel. You might imagine that they would choose 2-3 over 1-1, because they get twice as much for themselves, 2 versus 1, and 3 times as much for the other person. You might imagine they would choose 2-2 over 1-0, because they get twice as much for themselves, and they get far more for the other person. But there's something funny about these distributions, and that was intentional. It's true that everybody gets more when you choose 2-3, but that means the other kid, this anonymous stranger, gets relatively more than the child. Everybody gets more if you choose 2-2, but then the child's giving up a relative advantage that he'd have from 1-0. And what we find for children up to the age of 8, they go for the smaller amounts. It's not that they're selfish, they're worse. They will give up resources, either not to find themselves in a relative disadvantage, or so as not to give up a relative advantage. I mentioned this to my lab group. Actually, I mentioned this first to a Jewish group at Yale, a Hillel group, and somebody came up to me and said, there's a Jewish folktale like this. An envious man comes down to earth, an angel comes down to earth and finds an envious man and says to the envious man, I will give you anything you want, but I will give you your neighbor double. And the man thinks for a bit and says, I want you to pluck out one of my eyes. And then I told this to my lab group, and one of my students said, hey, there's an Irish folktale like this. And the punchline is, I want you to beat me half to death. So all of this supports a character, Kingsley Amis saying, a character in Kingsley Amis' novel saying, it's no wonder that people are so horrible when they start their life as children. I will tell you, by the way, this is not uniquely human. So this is a study by Franz de Waal and Sarah Brosnan with capuchins. And the idea is that they give a token and they get a prize back, either a cucumber or a grape. Now they like cucumbers and they like grapes, but they like grapes a lot more. So the one on the left gets a cucumber, but then observes as the one on the right gets a grape. So we have an innate morality, I would argue, but one that is fundamentally limited. And the question is what happens to us through the course of development that transforms us, that expands our moral circle, that gives us an understanding of fairness and justice. And there's a lot to be said about this. And I just have a few minutes. What I just want to do is simply mention 2 processes that are at work. One process is an expansion of our emotions. The normal, natural scope of emotions like compassion and caring and guilt and shame are those in our immediate vicinity. But we can, in all different ways, expand them, even to strangers. And this is actually one of the powers of fiction and one of the powers of journalism. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum points out, although all of the future citizens who saw ancient tragedies, she saw them Greek tragedies, were male, they were asked to have empathy to the suffering of many whose lot could never be theirs, such as Trojans and Persians and Africans, such as wives and daughters and mothers. This could have a tremendous force, I think, for good. And there's real-world examples like this. This is Harriet Beecher Stowe. The story, which is perhaps apocryphal, is that Abraham Lincoln invited her to the White House in the middle of the Civil War, and upon seeing her said, "So you're the little lady who started this great big war." And he was talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is not a great work of literature. It's certainly not a great work of philosophy or theology or law. But what it does is it got its readers, first readers in the North, then in the South, to imaginatively engage in what it must be like to be a slave, triggering the same sort of moral feelings that have been calibrated for those close to you and extending them more broadly. And I think this is a huge force for moral change. But a second force for moral change is not the heart, but the head. And here, and I want to end this talk with more Adam Smith. So Adam Smith's talking about the extension of morality to strangers, for when we do good things for people we don't know, when we give up things that would help us for the good of others. And he says, why? And he says, it's not the soft power of humanity. It's not that feeble spark of benevolence which nature hath lifted up in the human heart. It is reason, principle, conscience that calls to us with a voice capable of astonishing the most presumptuous of our passions, that we are but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other in it. And this is often described as a principle of impartiality. The principle of impartiality shows up in every religion there is, in every variant of the Golden Rule. And also in every philosophical tradition, from the consequentialist to the deontologist to social contract theory, what they all share is the insight that none of us, that in a deep sense, none of us are special. We could have just as well been somebody else. And that to be a good person ultimately requires the reasoning capacity and the self-discipline to pull ourselves out from our individual situation and see the world as a whole. There's all sorts of arguments for it, but my favorite summary of it is from the Humphrey Bogart character in Casablanca. And I will spare you my attempt to imitate it, to give you his voice, because I did that once and it did not go well. So, spoiler alert, he's telling his lover at the end of the movie that they have to separate, acknowledging that this would cause sadness to her, to him, and to another person. But in explaining why, he says this: it doesn't take much to see that the problems of three little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. And that sort of moral insight is extraordinarily powerful. And it's something that good societies and good parents and good teachers nurture in developing children, to allow them to take a broader picture, to extend morality away from their personal circumstances and turn it into sort of a real morality, which might involve sacrifice for the good of others, even strange others. I'm interested in the origin of human kindness, and I think that the answer to this has two parts. One is that we're born with it, that we have as part of our innate evolved capacity some degree of empathy, compassion, care, some capacity to tell right from wrong, even some rudimentary sense of justice. But the other part is not part of our biological inheritance. It's something which has been hard fought over human history. And to the extent we're fully moral beings, it's the product of our compassion and our imagination and our extraordinary powers of reason. Thank you.